This is the IBJ podcast for the week of January 28th, 2019. I'm Mason King.
Adam Dyer. Anthony Aldridge. James Elliott.
You just heard a segment of the annual Homeless People's Memorial Service held in December to honor those who died in Indianapolis in 2018. The bell you heard rang dozens of times, corresponding to the highest number of deceased since homeless advocates started keeping records more than a decade ago. To get a sense of the severity of the problem, consider these statistics. In 2015, 40 people who were either homeless or had recently left the streets died in Indianapolis. The number rose to 50 in 2016, 58 in 2017, and 70 just last year. And the significant increase in deaths has occurred while the overall homeless population has remained relatively stable in the range of 1,600 to 1,800 people. Now, authoritative information about these deaths is not easy to find. In an effort to explain why homeless people are dying in increasing numbers, IBJ's Hayleigh Colombo collected a list of names from advocacy groups and then asked the Marion County Coroner's Office for information about each death. In 22 cases, no cause of death was listed. Those that are known include homicide, drug use, hypothermia, thermal burns, and complications from various diseases. Hayleigh's research, coupled with interviews with the public and not-for-profit workers on the ground supporting the homeless, provides compelling and rare insight into a major public health problem. We've asked two homeless advocates to join us in the studio to talk about the circumstances of these deaths, what can be done about them, and why some seemingly obvious solutions are far from cure-alls. Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get right to our panel for this week's podcast. First, we have IBJ reporter Hayleigh Colombo, who examines the problem in this week's edition of IBJ as part of her ongoing series, One City, Worlds Apart. Welcome back, Hayleigh.
Hi, Mason.
Also with us today is Chelsea Haring-Cozzi, the Executive Director of the Coalition for Homelessness Intervention and Prevention, otherwise known as CHIP. Thanks for being with us today, Chelsea.
Hi, Mason. Thanks for having me.
And we're also happy to have Melissa Burgess, Program Manager for Horizon House, which helps provide vital services and shelter for the homeless population. Thanks for joining us, Melissa.
Thank you, Mason.
Hayleigh, let's start with you. Can you give us the quick 60-second rundown of the impetus for the story and what you set out to find?
Indianapolis is facing a problem, which is that we have too many individuals who are unsheltered, who are not secure in, where they're going to, put their head down each night. And essentially, homelessness is, not only is it a sad existence for people, but it's also a deadly way of living.
I mean, this is a problem I think that's uniquely difficult for people like me to understand, because it doesn't happen to people that I know, and it doesn't happen to places where I go. So, Chelsea and Melissa, could you paint a picture for us where we're finding people who have died?
So honestly, we're finding people in all kinds of situations all over the city, some which are very visible and some which are hidden, that you or me or Melissa or Hayleigh on our regular day-to-day would have no idea people were living and trying to survive. Some of the people that have experienced homelessness that have passed away have done so unsheltered in homeless camps, tucked away, kind of in the outskirts of the city or outskirts of downtown, that again, we wouldn't see just driving in our day-to-day, but people are back there struggling. Some people have died in shelter, coming in from the cold, but in shelter, and others have died after being housed. And so we've really kind of seen the spectrum of those who have experienced homelessness and what situation they find themselves in when they have passed away.
Hayleigh, I know that you did a lot of, I'm assuming it's kind of a groundbreaking work just into looking into how they died.
So I worked with the coroner's office, who was kind enough to provide me this cause of death, manner of death data, and essentially we're finding a very wide range of causes of death. One man this year passed away from hypothermia. Many people were victims of violent crimes. They're homicide victims, which is something I feel like was extremely eye-opening to me. I feel like people try to conflate homeless people as criminals in some respect, but a lot of the time they're victims of violent crime. And then, not necessarily as surprising to me, but still sad to find, is that a lot of folks passed away due to acute drug overdoses. So that was really what we sort of found. One particularly sad instance, and this shows up in the data, is that there was a man who passed away from burns. He was trying to keep his tent warm.
Yeah, Melissa, how about that? Is there a spike in drug use? Is it the same amount of drug use but just different drugs? What are you seeing on the street?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think it's a combination of, we have an increase in people experiencing homelessness. That's definitely on the rise. And then we also are seeing a significant increase in usage, whether that's spice, KD, synthetic marijuana, obviously heroin, opiates, that's now laced with fentanyl. A significant increase. We've had significant, as you said, Hayleigh, with the deaths of the overdoses and just the homicide rate as well. I mean, multiple deaths due to that. We refer to our folks, obviously, as the most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So whether they're in the encampments, they're preyed upon. They're preyed upon by the drug dealers. They're preyed upon by fellow drug users to just sell the drugs, to use the drugs, and then ultimately, unfortunately, are overdosing due to wherever they're at in their journey of life with not being ready for treatment.
Tell me about the camps real quick, because I'm not familiar with the camps or where they are. We were talking a little bit before the conversation, but there's some camps, and I guess close to the downtown Indianapolis, and in environments that have been around for decades.
Yeah, we refer to a camp as, obviously where anybody is residing. That's their home. We refer to that as their home. So our team, we cover all of Marion County. Obviously, a significant portion of our population reside either in or close to downtown due to a variety of resources. That's where most of the resources are. The river, as most know, that's a very popular area.
That's White River, I'm assuming.
White River, yeah, White River, sorry. That's a big chunk of our folks on both sides of the river, anywhere from, maybe 16th Street down past Raymond on both sides. That's a big, heavy area. But then we also have them on the outskirts as well. And so some are very well-established camps. Some can be transient. And so typically you may have a mayor, per se, who may be the leader of the encampment, who makes sure that, resources are brought in, that everybody's taken care of. If somebody's needing additional blankets or food or linkage to treatment or resources, then they do that. But they're pretty well-established, and you'd be surprised. Some are, tents, unfortunately, as the one who was burned in the tent, to structures with 4 walls and doors and windows. So it's a wide array of encampments. And the individual that passed away, yes, in the tent, a lot of them will use candles and sternos to help heat the tent. And unfortunately, then that becomes very dangerous and deadly.
Mm-hmm. For the individuals experiencing homelessness that are living in the camps, while again, the preference is to connect people to housing and care and get people sheltered. While they are in the camps, that becomes their network. That becomes their sense of stability, of socialization, of order and structure. And so it becomes kind of a very vital fabric to their existence. And when a camp closes or is displaced, I think that really kind of disrupts that sense of stability. Over the last year, in 2018, we saw just shy of a dozen camps that were closed around the city, which again then displaces people and disrupts that network and that sense of stability that they have, which I think increases their vulnerability to become just what we've talked about, victims of crime, or to have to find kind of a new social circle to fit into for that kind of protection and stability and access to resources.
So just for the record, if we want to draw a line from 2015, there were 40 deaths in the homeless population that were recorded in 15. The next year it was 50. In 2017 it was 58. In 2018 it was 70. So that's a pretty steep climb over several years. You mentioned the breakup of the encampments. Would there also be other factors that would be leading to that trend?
I mean, I think some of what Melissa and Hayleigh both talked about, an increased drug usage and that's steadily been over the last several years that we've seen not just an increased usage, but a different type of mix of drugs that really does kind of become more pervasive in the population of individuals experiencing homelessness. And I think part of that is because that becomes a way to access medication, if you will, without other options. And so you have, I think, a number of individuals that are already more vulnerable to chronic health issues, that are struggling potentially with mental health issues, but don't have access to what you and I consider traditional forms of medication. And so what they can access becomes their way of self-medicating and addressing some of these other more chronic health issues.
Is there reason to believe that mental health issues also play a significant role in why some would be dying?
I would say absolutely. I think to, again, refer back to what we keep talking about with the substance use, a lot of individuals with significant mental health issues may use substances to kind of supplement their self-medicating. If they're not accessing healthcare or mental health treatment and they're not comfortable for whatever reason, they're self-medicating. And so, that in turn obviously can increase their risk for death, especially. And I think also, people who have been diagnosed with or living with mental health issues have a shorter lifespan than somebody who's not diagnosed with a mental health issue. And I was going to go back to what, to piggyback really fast on what Chelsea had said too. I think we are seeing a significant increase in people experiencing homelessness who are dying once they're in housing. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important to note as well, because what we've seen in the last several years is once somebody there's cultural issues with agreeing to kind of enter the system of housing. That goes back to culture, that goes back to community. When you've been in an encampment for multiple years, you finally are ready to start talking about housing, you kind of succumb to the system of housing, and so then you lose your community in the encampment, but then you're in permanent housing. But what happens with that is you lose your community, but then you isolate. And so we're seeing a significant trend of death of people who are placed in permanent housing because the only thing I can relate that to, I think I was telling you, Hayleigh, is, for those of us that maybe were in college and at the end of the semester we're able to take a break, and you're able to take a breath, and we tend to get sick. If you're experiencing homelessness in multiple years of neglect to your body, to your health care, to your physical well-being, then you're placed into permanent housing. The stress and trauma of experiencing homelessness is to that degree is lifted because you have safety and security of a door that locks. So you're able to take a breath, and what we find then is significant medical conditions and people dying. They're then diagnosed with long-term illnesses or cancer or something like that, which then increases their risk to death, which is a fascinating, unfortunate trend that we're seeing.
In this context, when we're talking about permanent housing, can you give me some examples of what that would be?
So we consider permanent supportive housing. That's our main community housing that individuals experiencing homelessness are eligible for. So they may be mostly experiencing chronic homelessness and have some type of either mental health or physical disability. So they're eligible for this federal housing that this is permanent supportive housing. So we put them in. We help put them into housing and then wrap them up with support. And then the other piece of that is rapid rehousing. So you kind of have two silos. You have the permanent supportive housing, and then you have the rapid rehousing for folks who may just need minimal support to then, it's short term, to then be on the road to being permanently housed.
And I think that, both examples are, there's, kind of a pathway to housing that provides some level of rental assistance, and that depends really on the person's need. But a key component of that is engagement with a community and a network, and ideally engagement with services to help address some of the other ongoing issues that individuals struggle with. And so I think what's key, and when you look at those who have passed away, who have been housed, is housing is part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. Housing in and itself is not the sole answer. And so it really is making sure that people, once housed, are still connected to care, connected to community, and connected to the supports that they need to then address some of the other issues that they are going to continue to struggle with, whether that be addiction, whether that be mental health, whether that be chronic illness.
One thing that just by talking to these folks over the last couple weeks was very eye-opening to me is, somewhat like when you don't necessarily have any personal experience with this issue, it can be really hard to wrap your head around. And I think one thing that we talked about is how something that would not be a big deal to people with housing, or people who have, not only a network with housing, but a network with healthcare and, friends and family, your own supply of first aid kit stuff in your bathroom, is like something very minor can snowball into something much bigger.
I'm going to go back to the statistics that we were talking about earlier. And about the homicides, do you have a sense of how many of the deaths were linked to homicide?
So there were 6, or at least 6 deaths that were attributable to homicide, according to the records that the coroner provided to me. However, we have to couch that with, it's not necessarily 6 out of 70, because it's at least 6 out of 70, because there are many people that we don't have cause and manner of death information for.
So that's close to 10%. Does that surprise you guys?
I don't know if it's surprising, but it's sad, obviously, that there's that significant of a portion of our population that the death was from homicide.
And I think what, that highlights to me are a couple things. One, back to what we talked about in the beginning of the perception that individuals experiencing homelessness are actually those engaged in kind of criminal activity and targeting other people, when in reality, and we know this, and I think that data helps support that, they are actually more likely to themselves be the victims of crime and targeted by criminal activity. This is not just an issue that those in the homeless service sector should be looking at and paying attention to. This is also a public safety issue. This is a healthcare issue, and a public safety issue in that those experiencing homelessness need protection as well. And it's much harder, again, when you don't have a stable residence to pick up and call and say, hey, I'm being targeted, or I'm afraid I'm going to be a victim of a crime. So even access to those kinds of resources and protection are different when you don't have stable housing and you're on the streets.
This is a healthcare issue. This is a public safety issue. This is a human rights issue. That our folks, I think, unfortunately, they are the victims. Absolutely, hands down, are the victims.
And I think for that survivability, people are willing to put themselves in situations maybe that put them at risk if it means maybe they can couch on crash on a couch that night, or they might be able to have shelter over their head or get a hot meal. I think particularly when we're looking at women and youth putting themselves in risky situations in terms of domestic violence or in terms of potential trafficking, that then again heightens their risk at becoming victims of crime, but kind of in that mode of survivability and finding a place to be sheltered and out of the element.
So what do we do? What can we do to reverse this trend?
I mean, I think advocacy and education absolutely around the scope of the problem, around helping people really understand what it means to experience homelessness and helping destigmatize that and getting people, everyone, to kind of see their place in it, and that this is not something, again, that is just going to be solved by those working in the homeless service sector. It really will take a collaborative effort. The other part is, I think, a continued push by people in the city government around creating more housing units and more affordable housing that people can occupy, helping build up a more robust social service support system for once those access housing. I think that's been a big challenge because services is considered one thing and you can bill for services, but if you're just engaging and building a relationship, there's no way to cover the costs of that. And so how do we help the social support services engage people to get to a place of service provision with resources? We haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. I think that's a really, really important piece of it. And then ensuring that, again, policies are out there that help support this work and do it in a compassionate and humane way is a key component of that as well.
How many people, and I know this number changes over the course of the year, but how many people typically are homeless in Marion County at any given time?
So we are actually coming up on our annual point in time count on January 30th. So each year our community spends one night kind of doing that exact thing, getting a snapshot on a given night, how many people are experiencing homelessness in our city. Last year it was just under 1,700, so I think 1,682 individuals on one single night in the city were experiencing homelessness.
And how has that population either grown or shrunk or leveled off?
So that's a good question. I know that we saw a decrease this past year from the previous year, but we did see a slight increase in unsheltered homelessness. So we did see a decrease in sheltered. We did see a small decrease in family homelessness.
From my perspective, just on the streets, not the data really per se, but we definitely are seeing an increase in the encampments. And there, they could be those that are just transient moving through, but we're seeing a lot that are sticking around and long term.
Another sort of point of conversation that we had previously was that as the general population is aging, so is the homeless population, and then that is also like putting people at risk. So just like there are more people who are, in their 60s and 70s out on the street, grappling with chronic health issues that they're not able to take care of, and that could be also a reason for some of these deaths.
Guys, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mason and Hayleigh.
My thanks to Chelsea, Melissa, and of course, Hayleigh, whose story appears in this week's edition of IBJ. And I want to draw your attention to a few more stories of interest. In 2018, 13 tech companies in the Indianapolis area were sold, which is a lot for us, and on one hand can be a good thing. Many entrepreneurs have chosen that line of work for the opportunity to score a big exit. But as Anthony Shetley reports, some worry that the acquisitions could be eroding Indianapolis's tech ecosystem before it fully blossoms. And Lindsay Erdoty marks the progress that Governor Eric Holcomb has made on one of his top priorities, making sure the Hoosier workforce is adequately prepared to fill the skilled jobs companies need to grow. In some cases, he's surpassed some targets. In others, he's lagging behind. You can read all about it in this week's paper, which you undoubtedly have delivered to your home or office every week, or at IBJ.com. And for full and unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning content, just click the subscribe button. As always, thanks for checking out the podcast. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.